The church was an ocean of flowers, lilies and roses. Robert's absolute favorites spilled from every available surface, their sweet, cloying perfume hanging heavy and thick in the solemn air. It felt suffocating, a beautiful scent that I knew I would associate with the worst day of my life from now on. In this moment, all I could truly smell was the sharp, metallic tang of my own grief. My hands, resting in my lap, trembled so violently that I had to clench them into fists to make them stop. I sat rigidly in the center of the front pew, my gaze fixed on the polished mahogany of my husband's casket. 50 years. We had 50 years together, a whole lifetime, and now it was all gone. Just like that. An entire history, a shared world, had vanished in the space of a single silent breath. The finality of it was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest and making it impossible to draw in a full lungful of air. "Are you all right, Mom?" My daughter Laura leaned in, her voice a strained whisper against my ear. She squeezed my hand, her own fingers cold despite the stuffy warmth of the crowded sanctuary. Her eyes, so much like my own, were red-rimmed and swollen from a morning spent crying. I managed a short, jerky nod, completely unable to form a word. What was there to possibly say? What words could ever articulate the chasm that had opened up in my life? Robert was gone. My Robert. The void he left behind was not something that could be filled with language or condolences. It was an active, consuming emptiness. He had been my rock, my steadfast anchor for half a century. People had been filing in all morning, a somber parade of black suits and dark dresses. I watched them from a detached distance, as if I were observing a scene in a movie. Old friends from our college days, colleagues from Robert's long career, neighbors we'd shared fences and holidays with for decades. Their faces were masks of solemnity as they murmured their sympathies, their words of comfort blurring into a meaningless hum. "So sorry for your loss, Helen. He was a wonderful man. If there's anything you need." Some of the faces were vaguely familiar, ghosts from a distant past that Robert, always the more social one, had diligently kept in touch with while I had slowly faded into the background as so many wives do. It was a role I had accepted, and even cherished, but now, sitting here alone, it felt like a foolish choice. My eyes scanned the crowd and landed on my son Thomas, as he entered through a large oak door at the side of the sanctuary. His wife, Victoria, was glued to his arm, her posture ramrod straight. A painful lurch seized my heart. "Oh, Thomas." He looked so much like his father it was almost unbearable. He had the same tall, strong frame, the same defined jaw, and the same kind eyes that had first made me fall in love with Robert all those years ago. But today, those eyes were different. They were cold, shuttered, and achingly distant. Victoria guided him forward with a proprietary hand on the small of his back. She was impeccably dressed in a designer black sheath dress, a string of lustrous pearls clasped around her long neck. She looked more prepared for a high-powered business luncheon than for her father-in-law's funeral. That detail struck me with a sharp pang of bitterness. They had not come to the hospital, not even once during those harrowing final weeks. There was always a pressing deadline, a client that couldn't be rescheduled, a dizzying array of excuses that sounded flimsier each time they were offered. The truth was, they were simply too busy for a dying man. "I should go say hello to your brother," I whispered to Laura, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Mom, don't." "Not right now." Laura's voice was tight, her grip on my hand intensifying. She and Thomas hadn't spoken a civil word to each other in months, not since the terrible argument they'd had over Robert's medical care. Victoria, with her endless talk of pragmatism, had insisted that hospice was the only sensible option. Laura, my passionate, hopeful girl, had wanted to pursue a new, experimental treatment she'd researched tirelessly online. The battle lines had been drawn then and there, a cruel war waged over the fading life of their father, and I had been trapped in the devastating crossfire, watching my husband slip away while my two children, the products of our great love, fought as if they were mortal enemies. The service began, and the pastor's deep, resonant voice filled the church. He spoke of Robert's life, of his many accomplishments, his integrity, his unwavering love for his family. I tried to listen, I truly did, but I could barely hear the words over the roar of my own memory. My mind reeled back through time, showing me flashes of our life together in a dizzying, heartbreaking montage. Our wedding day, Robert so nervous he nearly dropped the ring. The overwhelming joy of holding our babies, Laura and then Thomas, for the first time. Countless quiet evenings spent on our back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, our hands clasped together even after all those decades. That simple, constant touch was something I had taken for granted. Now the thought of never feeling it again was a pain so sharp it stole my breath. It was time for the family to speak. Laura went first, her voice thick with emotion but steady. She shared sweet, funny stories of her father, how he taught her to ride her bicycle on the bumpy sidewalks of our old neighborhood, his patient hand on the back of the seat until she finally found her balance, how he spent hours helping her with a complicated science project, building a volcano that actually erupted all over our kitchen floor, and how he had wept openly, unashamedly, as he walked her down the aisle on her wedding day. When it was Thomas's turn, he simply shook his head, declining to speak. He just sat there, rigid and unmoving, beside Victoria, who kept leaning over to whisper insistently in his ear. What could she possibly be saying to him at a moment like this? Finally, it was my turn. My legs felt as though they were filled with wet sand as I made my way to the podium. I gripped its sides for support, looking out at the vast sea of faces. Some were familiar and kind. Others were strangers, all of them watching me, waiting. I began, but my voice immediately cracked, shattering into a million pieces. Robert was everything to me. My husband, my best friend, my partner in all things. The tears that I had been holding back for hours finally broke free, flowing in hot streams down my cheeks. I didn't bother to wipe them away. 50 years of profound love and partnership deserved these tears. They were a testament to what we had shared. We had our struggles, of course. Like any couple, I continued, my voice gaining a little strength. But we always faced them together. That's what a real marriage is. It's standing together, shoulder to shoulder, through all the good and all the bad. From the corner of my eye, I saw Victoria lean over and whisper something to the woman sitting next to her. Her lips, painted a deep shade of crimson, curled into what could only be described as a smirk. The sight was so jarring, so profoundly disrespectful, that it nearly derailed my train of thought. I tried to pull my focus back, to honor my husband, but my voice began to falter. I will miss him, I managed to choke out, the words feeling utterly inadequate. Every day, for the rest of my life. The sobs overwhelmed me then, and I could say no more. As I turned from the podium, my entire body numb, the tears still blurring my vision, I heard it. The voice was not quite a whisper, yet not a full-fledged statement. It was a stage whisper, a venomous, sibilant sound, calculated to be heard by everyone in the immediate vicinity. It was Victoria's. "Look at those crocodile tears," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. She shouldn't even be crying. Everyone knows they were practically separated. The words sliced through the sacred silence of the church, hitting me with the force of a physical blow. I froze mid-step, one hand still resting on the back of the pew in front of me. I could not breathe. I could not move. It felt as if the air had been sucked from the room, replaced by a thick, ringing silence in my ears. A series of soft, shocked gasps rippled through the pews around us. Beside me, I saw Laura half rise from her seat, her face a mask of pure fury. "How dare you?" someone muttered from the row behind. But it was my son's reaction, or lack thereof, that truly shattered the last piece of my composure. He did not defend me. He did not turn to his wife with anger or disbelief. He did not contradict her vicious lie. Thomas simply looked away, his gaze falling to the floor as a dark flush of crimson crept up his neck. It was the flush of embarrassment, but it was not embarrassment for Victoria's monstrous behavior. I knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in my veins, that he was embarrassed for me, for my public display of grief, for the scene his wife had just created, for my very existence in that moment. Somehow, I made it the final few steps back to my seat. My legs moved automatically, but I felt nothing. My entire body was a hollow shell of numbness. 50 years of a loving, devoted marriage, a partnership built on mutual respect and unwavering affection, had just been reduced to malicious gossip and blatant lies. At my husband's funeral, and my own son, the boy I had raised, sat silently by while his wife tore my grief and my husband's memory to shreds. The rest of the service passed in a thick, impenetrable fog. I have no memory of the final prayers or the announcements about the reception that would follow. I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on me, could hear the rustle of whispers passing through the crowd like a foul wind. I felt their pity, their curiosity, and their judgment. As we finally filed out of the church, following the casket into the bright, unforgiving sunlight, Victoria walked ahead with Thomas, her head held high as if she were the queen of some grim parade. She turned her head once, her eyes meeting mine over the heads of the other mourners. A flicker of undisguised triumph gleamed in their depths before she turned away. But as I watched her strut toward the waiting limousine, a flicker of something else stirred within my chest, a tiny ember glowing in the midst of the cold ash of my despair. There was one more thing to endure today, one final act that neither Victoria nor Thomas knew was coming. Robert's will was to be read immediately after the service, at his own specific and unshakable request. He had insisted upon, and despite the humiliation that was burning a hole in my soul, I couldn't help but feel that small, defiant spark of anticipation. Robert had always been a meticulous planner. He saw things with a clarity that sometimes startled me, and he had seen through Victoria. Oh yeah, he had seen her with perfect vision long before I had allowed myself to accept the truth. The first time I met her, it was as if a series of tiny, silent alarm bells had gone off in my head. She was charming, of course. Almost too charming. Her laugh was a little too practiced, her smile a little too bright. Her interest in our family history, in Robert's business, in the value of our home, was there too eager. That night, after she and Thomas had dead, Robert had reached for my hand under the dinner table, giving it a quick, firm squeeze. It was a silent signal we had developed over decades of social events and family dinners. It meant, I feel it, too. Something isn't right here. She's just trying to impress us, Mom, Thomas had insisted later, when I tried to carefully voice some of my concerns. He was 38 at the time, and I knew he was beginning to worry that he would never find someone to settle down with. Victoria was beautiful, she was intelligent, and by all appearances, she was completely smitten with him. Who was I to stand in the way of my son's potential happiness? So I bit my tongue. The wedding was a lavish, ostentatious affair, far more elaborate than anything my practical, frugal son had ever wanted. But Victoria had insisted, her arguments cloaked in the language of investment and appearances. Somehow she convinced him to spend nearly his entire savings on the single-day event. Robert and I contributed what we could, a sum I had once considered generous. But I'll never forget the look on Victoria's face when she saw the check, a fleeting, barely there flicker of disappointment, before her perfect smile snapped back into place. Later, during the reception, I overheard her talking to Thomas by the towering, seven-tiered cake. Your parents don't really understand the importance of appearances, do they? She'd murmured, loud enough for me to hear as I passed by. It's sweet, really, in an old-fashioned way. The words were not just dismissive, they were a reframing of our values, painting our practicality and our lack of pretension as a charming but pitiful flaw. She was already beginning to isolate him, to subtly position us as the out-of-touch old folks who just didn't understand their sophisticated world, and my son, so blinded by his love for her, had simply nodded in agreement. That condescending remark at the wedding was just the beginning, the first small crack in the foundation of our family. The changes in Thomas afterward were subtle at first, a slow and insidious erosion. The weekly phone calls he had made without fail since leaving for college became less frequent. Family dinners, once a cherished Sunday tradition, were rescheduled to once a month, and then became a quarterly obligation that felt increasingly strained. When they did visit, Victoria always seemed to have a reason to cut the evening short, her eyes darting to the expensive watch on her wrist long before dessert was served. Thomas needs his rest, you know. He's been working so incredibly hard, she would say, her voice full of feigned concern as she'd rise from the table. My son's eyes, however, told a different story. I could see the conflict in them, the longing to stay mixed with the weary resignation of a man who had learned it was easier to appease his wife than to fight for what he actually wanted. Then came the litany of excuses. Birthdays were missed, holidays were canceled at the last minute, and our wedding anniversary was completely forgotten. Each time it was followed by profuse gushing apologies from Victoria and vague promises to make it up to you soon. A future that rarely, if ever, arrived. When Laura gave birth to her first child, a beautiful baby girl, Thomas and Victoria arrived at the hospital 3 days late. They swept in with a ridiculously expensive, impersonal gift from a designer baby boutique, but not a single ounce of genuine warmth. "We had a charity gala," Victoria had explained, waving a dismissive hand as if that settled the matter. She barely glanced at her new niece, sleeping peacefully in the bassinet. You simply cannot imagine how important these connections are for Thomas's career. "It's all about networking, Helen." She spoke the word networking as if it were a sacred duty, far more important than meeting a new member of one's own family. These charity events, these crucial business dinners, these endless networking opportunities, they all seem to have an uncanny knack for coinciding with family gatherings. Victoria ensured Thomas's calendar was perpetually full, a fortress of appointments that left precious little time for spontaneous visits or simple phone calls to his parents. And in the small pockets of time when we did see them, she would drip her poison, always in my hearing, always with a sweet smile on her face. "Your parents are so wonderfully set in their ways," she would say to Thomas, squeezing his arm. "They mean well, of course, but they just don't understand how the modern world works now." Or after I'd offer to pack them some leftovers from dinner, she'd laugh lightly and remark, "It's so sweet how your mom still thinks she needs to take care of you. Some mothers just can't let go, can they?" And the worst, the one that made my blood run cold, "They always make me feel like I'm just not good enough for you, like no one would ever be good enough for their precious son." At first Thomas would offer a weak defense. "That's not true, Mom and Dad love you." But as the years wore on, even that ceased. It was simply easier for him to agree, to nod along, to keep the peace with the woman who shared his bed. The true breaking point, the moment from which there was no return, came 3 years ago when Robert was diagnosed with cancer. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. They believed they had caught it early, but the recommended treatment would be aggressive, grueling, and of course incredibly expensive. We called a family meeting in our living room, the 4 of us, to discuss the path forward. The tension in the room was thick enough to taste. "We should discuss all the care options," Victoria said, her tone serious and businesslike. She sat on the edge of her armchair, a leather-bound planner open on her lap. "Realistically, these treatments are going to completely drain your retirement savings. And for what? A few more years, maybe." The callousness of the question hung in the air, so raw and ugly that even Thomas looked physically shocked. He stared at his wife, his mouth slightly agape. Victoria, seeing she had miscalculated, backtracked immediately, her face crumpled and her eyes filled with tears with a speed that was almost theatrical. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. She rushed over to me, kneeling on the floor and taking my hands in hers. Her fingers were cold, her manicure perfect. "I'm just so worried about you both. I want what's best for everyone, and sometimes that means making the hard choice." And just like that, with a breathtaking display of emotional manipulation, she had twisted her appalling cruelty into an act of profound concern. Thomas, so desperate to believe that the woman he loved was not a monster calculating the financial burden of keeping his own father alive, seemed to sag with relief. He accepted her performance, and the moment for a real confrontation was lost. When Robert, my strong, stubborn Robert, recovered after that first brutal round of treatment, I saw it. I saw the flash of undisguised disappointment in Victoria's eyes before she could mask it. She had been counting on his illness. She had been counting on an inheritance. Our savings, while modest, must have seemed like a fortune to her. The question started soon after. Had we updated our will recently? Was the house completely paid off? What about Robert's life insurance policy? Each question was asked with a practiced, airy casualness, as if she were merely showing a daughterly interest in our well-being. But I knew what she was doing. She was taking inventory. Robert saw through it all, of course. He saw every calculated move, heard every insincere word. One evening, after another tense and deeply unpleasant family dinner, where Victoria had relentlessly grilled us about our financial advisors and investment portfolios, he finally reached his limit. He said nothing at the table, simply enduring the interrogation with a quiet, stony patience. But after Thomas and Victoria left, he took my hand and led me down the hall to his study. The room was his sanctuary, filled with the scent of old books and the cedarwood he loved. He closed the door firmly behind me. "I need to make some changes, Helen," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. He walked over to his large oak desk and pulled out a thick file of legal documents, the same one he always kept our important papers in. "I've been thinking about this for a long while now, and I can't put it off any longer." I nodded, my heart both heavy and relieved. I understood immediately what he meant. There was no need for him to elaborate. "Thomas won't like it," I said softly, stating the obvious. Robert let out a long, weary sigh, and in the soft lamplight, he suddenly looked much older than his 73 years. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, etched by a sorrow that only a parent can know. "Thomas isn't thinking clearly," he said, his voice laced with pain. "He hasn't been for years, but I have to believe that someday, he'll see the truth of his situation. He has to. And when he does, we need to make sure he's protected. We need to make sure there's something left for him to come back to." He looked at me then, his eyes pleading for me to understand. "The boy we raised is still in there, Helen. He's just lost right now." Over the next few months, Robert met with our attorney, Mr. Clark, several times. He never explained the specific details of the changes he was making, and I never asked. Our trust in each other was absolute, a silent, unshakable cornerstone of our 50-year marriage. I simply knew that he was doing what he felt was necessary to set things right, to protect the legacy we had built together from the grasping hands of a woman who saw it as nothing more than a prize to be won. When the cancer returned last year, it came back with a vengeance, far more aggressive than before. The doctors gave us the news with gentle, somber faces, and we both knew this was a battle Robert would not win. And yet he seemed to be both at peace with. The frantic anxiety of his first diagnosis was gone, replaced by a profound and quiet calm. "Promise me something, Helen," he said to me one night. I was sitting by his hospital bed, holding his hand, the rhythmic beep of the machines the only sound in the sterile room. "Promise me you won't tell them about the changes to the will, not until after I'm gone." "Robert, don't talk like that," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "You're going to beat this again. We'll fight it just like before." He smiled, a weak but loving gesture. We both knew it was a lie, a comforting fiction we no longer had the luxury of believing. The treatment wasn't working this time. "She will just try to make Thomas contest it," he insisted, his grip on my hand surprisingly strong. "It will turn everything into a war while I'm still here. I don't want my last days to be a battlefield. Promise me, Helen." Through my tears, I promised. And I kept that promise. I kept it through the horrible, painful final months. I kept it as we transitioned to hospice care in our own home, turning our familiar bedroom into a sick room. I kept it when Victoria stopped visiting entirely, claiming with dramatic flair that the sight of Robert in a hospital bed was simply too upsetting for her delicate constitution. I kept it during Thomas's infrequent, solitary visit. He would stand awkwardly by the bed, guilty and lost, completely unable to meet my eyes, staying for only a few minutes before muttering an excuse and fleeing. I kept my promise at the funeral, even as Victoria's cruel, callous words cut through the very fabric of my grief. And I was keeping it now as we drove in the black limousine from the church to Mr. Clark's downtown office, where Robert's last wishes would finally be revealed. Victoria sat across from me, the picture of impatience. She kept checking the diamond-encrusted watch on her wrist as if she had somewhere far more important to be. "Let's hope this doesn't take too long," she whispered loudly to Thomas, who sat numbly beside her. We really need to start figuring out what to do with the house. The market is incredibly hot right now, you know. Thomas just nodded absently, his gaze fixed on the passing city streets. But in that brief, unguarded moment, I caught it again, a flicker of deep discomfort in his eyes, a shadow of the kind, thoughtful boy Robert and I had raised, a small, essential part of him that, after years of his wife's relentless influence, had not yet been completely erased. My husband had placed all his final hopes on that flicker. The attorney's office was cold and impersonal, all polished dark wood and muted gray upholstery. Victoria, Thomas, Otter and I were seated around a long gleaming conference table that felt as vast and empty as a frozen lake. Laura sat beside me, her hand finding mine under the table, a small anchor of warmth in the chilly room. Victoria, across from us, had finally put her phone away and was now checking her reflection in the polished surface of the table, subtly patting her immaculate hair. A moment later, the door opened, and Mr. Clark entered. He was a kind, steady man who had been Robert's attorney and friend for over 30 years, and his face was etched with a gentle sorrow. He carried a thick file in his hands and gave me a brief, compassionate nod before taking his seat at the head of the table. Victoria immediately straightened her spine, her expression shifting into one of appropriate solemnity, a mask she could put on and take off at will. "Before we begin the formal proceedings," Mr. Clark said, his voice calm and steady, "Mr. Anderson left some very specific instructions. There is a letter that he insisted must be read first, before the will itself." He looked directly at me and slid a simple cream-colored envelope across the polished wood. "He asked that you read it aloud, Helen." My name, written in Robert's familiar, strong handwriting, seemed to blur before my eyes. My hands trembled as I took the envelope. It felt impossibly heavy. What final words had my husband left for us? What bombshell was he about to drop from beyond the grave? I slid my finger under the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It felt worn, as if Robert had folded and unfolded it many times before, finding the right words. I cleared my throat, the sound loud in the silent room, and began to read. "My dearest family," I started, my voice wavering. "If you are reading this, then it means I have moved on to whatever comes next. Please do not be sad for too long. We all knew this day would eventually come, and I have made my peace with it." Before Clark reads the legal details of my will, I wanted to take a moment to explain my decisions. Throughout my life, I have always tried to do what is right, not what is easy. This final act is no different. I paused to take a shaky breath, feeling the weight of Robert's love envelop me. "Helen, my love, you gave me 50 beautiful, incredible years. You stood by my side through every success and every failure, through sickness and through health. When the world seemed to be spinning out of control, you were my anchor. Everything that I am, everything that I ever achieved in this life, I owe to your unwavering love and support." Tears streamed down my face now, but I didn't care. Across the table, Victoria shifted impatiently. My gaze moved to the next paragraph. "Thomas, my son, I have watched with a heavy and pained heart as you have slowly drifted away from the values that your mother and I tried so hard to instill in you." I glanced up at Thomas. He refused to meet my eye, his gaze fixed on his tightly clasped hands on the table. Victoria placed a hand on his knee, a gesture that looked more like a warning than a comfort. "I do not blame you," I continued reading Robert's words. "We all lose our way sometimes. I only hope that one day, you will remember who you really are, the man you were raised to be. Laura, my girl, thank you. Thank you for your strength and your fire, especially during this past year. Your mother is going to need that strength in the days and months ahead. I love you dearly." Laura squeezed my hand, a silent sob shaking her shoulder. "I have made choices in this will that may surprise some of you," I read from the final paragraph. "They were not made in anger or in spite. They were made with clear eyes and a full, albeit heavy heart. I have built something over my lifetime, and I want to ensure that it serves the right purpose after I am gone. Love always, Dad." I folded the letter carefully, my vision completely blurred. The room was utterly silent. save for the sound of Laura's quiet weeping and the impatient tap-tap-tap of Victoria's fingernail against the wood of the table. Mr. Clark cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Now," he said gently, "to the formal reading of the last will and testament of Robert Edward Anderson." Victoria straightened in her chair again, the brief flicker of annoyance on her face vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. A small, confident smile played at the corners of her mouth. She reached for Thomas's hand, squeezing it in a gesture of triumphant anticipation, as if they were about to be crowned. "To my wife, Helen Ann Anderson," Miss Clark read in a formal monotone. "I leave our family home, located at 257 Blossom Lane, free and clear of any mortgage or lien, along with a monthly stipend of $4,000 for the remainder of her natural life, to be drawn from my pension." I nodded slowly. This much I had expected. Our home was not grand, but it was ours, every wall saturated with 50 years of laughter, tears and memories. "To my daughter, Laura Ann Anderson Jensen," he continued, "I leave the sum of $100,000 and my entire collection of first edition books, which she has always admired." Laura gasped softly beside me, her eyes wide. "The books," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "The collection was valuable, yes, but more than that, it was a piece of her father's heart, something they had shared and bonded over for her entire life. To my son, Thomas Robert Anderson," Mr. Clark said, turning a page, "I leave the sum of $10,000. Victoria's head snapped up as if she had been struck. Her confident smile evaporated, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. "That's it?" she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you serious? 10,000? Thomas sat completely frozen, his face a canvas of utter confusion and shock. Mr. Clark held up a placating hand, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm brewing on Victoria's face. "However," he said, his voice cutting through her furious hiss, "Miss Anderson was not finished with his bequests concerning his son's family line." Victoria's outrage paused, her mouth hanging open slightly as a flicker of hope, or perhaps just greed, reignited in her eyes. She leaned forward, waiting. "Mr. Anderson has established a trust fund," Miss Clark continued, looking down at the document, "in the amount of $250,000 for his grandson, William Thomas Anderson. These funds are to be used exclusively for his education and his general well-being." "What does that mean?" Victoria demanded immediately, her voice sharp. "What does exclusively mean?" Mr. Clark looked at her over the rim of his glasses, his expression patient but firm. "It means, Anderson, that the funds can only be accessed for expenses that are directly related to William's schooling, his health care, and his basic needs. All disbursements must be approved." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the room. "Miss Helen Anderson and myself are named as the co-trustees of the fund." I watched as the color drained from Victoria's face, replaced by a mottled, angry red. The trust was a fortress, and Robert had given the keys to me and his most trusted advisor. She had been counting on a substantial, liquid inheritance, money she could control, money she could use to fund her lavish lifestyle and pay off the debts I was now certain she was hiding from my son. Instead, Robert had ensured that our grandson would be meticulously cared for, but in a way that Victoria could never ever exploit. She understood it all in an instant, and the look in her eyes was one of pure, venomous rage. "As for the remainder of my estate," Miss Clark went on, his voice steady, "including all of my investments, my retirement accounts, and the full proceeds from my life insurance policy." He paused, and I saw Victoria hold her breath. "I leave it, in its entirety, to the Robert and Helen Anderson Foundation, which I have established to support medical research for pediatric cancer treatment." This time, Victoria shot to her feet, the chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her carefully constructed mask of composure completely shattered. "There must be some mick. This is insane." She whirled on Thomas, who was still sitting in stunned silence, looking as if he'd been slapped. "Thomas, say something. This cannot possibly be legal." Thomas looked from his wife's furious face to Mr. Clark, his own expression one of dazed bewilderment. Dad left almost everything to charity, he stammered, the words barely audible. Mr. Clark nodded slowly. Mr. Anderson was quite specific about his wishes, Thomas. The foundation was something he and your mother discussed for many years. He turned his gentle gaze to me. Ever since your sister Anna passed away from leukemia. Anna, our firstborn. The daughter we had lost when she was only 7 years old. The mention of her name was like a key turning in a lock I had kept shut for decades. The pain, which had dulled over the years to a constant low-grade ache, flared with a sudden, breathtaking intensity. Robert and I had often talked, in quiet, hushed tones in the dead of night, about doing something meaningful in her memory, of creating some good from our most profound loss. But I had no idea. I had no idea he had actually gone through with it, that he had built this final, beautiful tribute to our lost girl. This is absolutely outrageous, Victoria sputtered, pacing behind her chair. We will contest this. Thomas is his son, his only son. He deserves his fair share. This is a clear case of an old man, not being in his right mind. Mrs. Anderson, Mr. Clark said, his voice dropping, taking on a tone of calm authority that commanded attention. I must strongly advise you against that course of action. Anderson fully anticipated a potential challenge to his will. He opened the thick file in front of him and turned it around for us to see. It was filled with tabbed sections, meticulous records, and spreadsheets. He left extensive documentation explaining the reasoning behind his decision. This includes detailed, dated records of all financial assistance and loans provided to Thomas over the years. These sums for various business ventures that never materialized, and other personal expenses, total well over $300,000. My eyes went to my son. Thomas's face, which had been confused and shocked, was now turning a ghastly shade of pale. The loans. The money he had asked for, swearing it was for a can't-miss investment. The huge sum for the down payment on the house that Victoria had insisted they needed. The money for the luxury car she claimed was essential for making the right impression with her clients. Robert had never once asked for repayment. He had given it freely as a father does for his son. But my meticulous, far-sighted husband had apparently kept perfect, detailed records of every single dollar. Mr. Clark delivered the final devastating blow. Contesting the will would force these financial records to become a matter of public record during the discovery process. He can't do this, Victoria whispered, but all the fight, all the conviction had vanished from her voice. She stared at the file as if it were a coiled snake. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Victoria stood frozen for a moment, her face a ghastly collage of fury and disbelief. She looked at the file, then at Mr. Clark, and finally at her husband, as if expecting him to somehow fix this, to wave a magic wand and make the inheritance she felt she was owed reappear. But Thomas just sat there, his face ashen, his eyes hollow with a dawning, sickening understanding. It's not fair, she whispered again, the words sounding pathetic and hollow in the quiet room. It's perfectly legal, Mrs. Anderson, Mr. Clark replied, his voice devoid of sympathy. He closed the file with a soft, final thud, and in my professional opinion, it would be exceptionally unwise to contest it. That was it. The final nail in the coffin of her ambitions. Laura reached over and squeezed my hand, a silent gesture of support and relief. I squeezed back, my heart aching with a strange mixture of sorrow and vindication. I hadn't known the full extent of Robert's plan, the meticulous, almost military precision of his defense. But I wasn't surprised. He had always believed in doing what was right, even when it was painful, and he had always protected his family. The meeting concluded shortly after. Victoria, without another word or even a glance in my direction, snatched her purse from the table and stormed out of the conference room, her heels clicking in angry staccato on the marble floor. Thomas, however, lingered behind. He looked utterly lost, like a small boy who had just watched his entire world crumble. "Mom," he said, his voice small and hoarse. He finally looked at me, and I could see the profound shock in his eyes. I didn't know. About the foundation. About Anne. The sound of our lost daughter's name on his lips, after so many years of unspoken grief, was almost my undoing. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. There's a lot you don't know, Thomas. I replied, my voice softer than I intended. But maybe now you'll start asking the right questions. He gave a slow, jerky nod, then turned and followed his wife out the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As Laura and I gathered our things, our coats and purses, Mr. Clark approached me quietly. Helen, one more thing, he said, handing me a small, plain envelope. Robert asked me to give you this, privately. I took it from him, my brow furrowed in confusion. Inside was a single, old-fashioned brass key and a small note, folded in half. I opened it, just a few words in Robert's beloved scrawl. For when you're ready. All my love, Rob. The next morning, I stood in my sun-drenched kitchen, going through the familiar, comforting motions of making coffee. I'd barely slept a wink, my mind replaying every moment from the day before. Victoria's outrage, Thomas's shattered confusion, the quiet triumph of Robert's final letter, and the mysterious key that now sat on my granite countertop, glinting in the morning light. What had Robert planned that even I didn't know about? My phone rang, the shrill sound jolting me from my thoughts. Laura's name flashed on the screen. Mom, have you seen what Victoria posted? She asked, her voice tight with a fresh wave of anger. My stomach dropped. A cold, familiar dread washed over me. No. What now? She's on Facebook. She's writing this long, rambling post, telling everyone that you and Dad manipulated him, that you took advantage of his weakened state when he was sick to change the will and punish Thomas for loving her. I sank into a kitchen chair, a wave of exhaustion so profound it made my bones ache. Oh, Laura, that's just absurd. Robert was completely lucid until the very end. He knew exactly what he was doing. I know that, and you know that, Laura said, her frustration evident. But she's painting herself and Thomas as the victims here. She's creating this whole narrative of elder abuse and greed. She's even tagged family members, old friends, people from church. It's disgusting. I closed my eyes, feeling a headache begin to throb behind them. It was another one of her performances, another attempt to control the story, to twist reality to suit her needs. Let her rant, I said, my voice weary. The people who really knew your father, who truly knew us, won't believe a word of it. But the damage was already spreading. Within hours my phone was buzzing incessantly with texts and incoming calls. Relatives and old acquaintances, stirred up by Victoria's post. Some called to offer their unwavering support, disgusted by her behavior. Others called with voices full of cautious questions, wondering if there was any truth to the story. A few, to my astonishment, even had the audacity to suggest that I should do the right thing and share the inheritance with Thomas, to keep the peace. As if on cue, my doorbell rang. I walked to the front door, my heart pounding, and peered through the peephole. It was Thomas, standing alone on my porch. He looked terrible. He hadn't shaved, and there were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes. He wore the same suit as yesterday, now rumpled and saggy. I hesitated for a long moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, I took a deep breath and opened the door. Mom, he said, his voice cracking. We need to talk. I let him in without a word, motioning toward the living room. He walked past me and sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, the same sofa where he'd built countless forts out of cushions as a boy. He looked deeply uncomfortable, a stranger in his own childhood home, and the sight of it sent a fresh pang of sorrow through me. Victoria wants me to contest the will, he blurted out, the words tumbling out in a rush before he could lose his nerve. She's found a lawyer who thinks we have a case. She says Dad wasn't thinking clearly. That because of the medication he was susceptible to. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. My voice was quiet, dangerously flat. Susceptible to being manipulated by me, you mean? Thomas had the decency to look ashamed, his gaze dropping to the worn pattern of the Persian rug. I didn't say that, he mumbled. But she did. I stated. It wasn't a question. He ran a hand through his greasy, disheveled hair, a gesture so painfully reminiscent of his father that it made my heart ache. She's upset, Mom. We were counting on that inheritance to pay off some debts. What kind of debts, Thomas? I asked, my voice still level. He looked away, staring at a landscape painting on the far wall. Victoria, her business ventures haven't been as successful as she claims, and she has expensive tastes. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. So she married you expecting that your father's money would eventually solve all of her problems. That's not fair, Mom, he shot back, a flicker of his old defensive anger surfacing. Isn't it? I challenged, my voice rising slightly. When is the last time she showed 1 ounce of genuine interest in your father? In me? In this family? When is the last time she came to this house for any reason other than to perform the role of a dutiful daughter-in-law while secretly taking inventory of our assets? He didn't answer, which was, of course, answer enough. Your father loved you more than anything, Thomas. But he wasn't blind. He was the least blind person I have ever known. He saw exactly what was happening. He saw how Victoria was systematically isolating you from us. How every conversation, every interaction was somehow angled toward money. He could have talked to me if he was that concerned, Thomas argued weakly. His voice cracked. The question that had been burning in my heart for years finally came out. Would you have listened? I asked, my voice raw. Honestly, would you have listened to him? Or would you have run straight home and reported everything back to Victoria, who would have twisted his words and convinced you that we were just being difficult and controlling as usual? His silence was a confession. It was a confirmation of every fear Robert and I had shared in hushed whispers in the dark. He knew I was right. If you contest this, Will, I said, my voice quiet again, laying out the final terrible truth, you will lose. Your father made certain of that. The documentation he left behind will not only prove his soundness of mind, but it will publicly humiliate you. And in the process, you will destroy whatever is left of our relationship. Is that what you want? No, he whispered, his shoulders slumping. He looked utterly broke. But I don't know what to do. Victoria is furious. She says I have to choose between her and you. My heart fractured for the boy trapped inside this broken man, a prisoner in a marriage built on a foundation of manipulation and control. That's not love, Thomas, I said gently. That's possession. He stood abruptly, needing to escape. I should go. I needed to see you. Thomas, I called out as he reached the doorway. He turned, his expression full of pain and confusion. Your father left something for you. Something that is not in the will. What? He asked, his brow furrowed. A chance, I said softly. A chance to remember who you really are. After he left, I sat alone in the profound quiet of the house, the silence amplifying my grief. Memories of Robert were everywhere. His favorite armchair still held the faint impression of his body. The collection of intricate model trains he had been painstakingly working on sat on a shelf in the den. The family photos lining the hallway chronicled a life, our life, that now felt like a distant dream. I walked over to the mantel and picked up the mysterious key Mr. Clark had given me, turning the cool brass over and over in my hands. What door was this meant to unlock? What had Robert left for me to find? That evening, just as darkness began to settle over the neighborhood, the doorbell rang again. I assumed it might be Laura coming to check on me, but when I opened the door, it was Victoria. She was, as always, perfectly put together. She wore an expensive, cream-colored suit, and her face was a serene mask of practiced concern. Helen? She said, her voice syrupy sweet. I'm so glad I caught you. I thought we should talk. Woman to woman. I almost shut the door in her face. The sheer audacity of her showing up here, after everything that had happened, was breathtaking. But a wave of morbid curiosity, a desire to see how she would play this next hand, got the better of me. I stepped aside, holding the door open. She swept into the living room, her eyes darting around, not with nostalgia or sentiment, but with the cold, calculating assessment of a real estate appraiser. This house has so much potential, she remarked, running a finger along the wooden mantelpiece. With the right renovations, a modern touch, it could be quite valuable. It's not for sale, I said, my voice as flat and hard as slate. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a practiced, brilliant thing, but utterly devoid of warmth. Of course not, Helen. But let's be practical. This place is far too big for just one person. And the upkeep, the taxes, it will all become quite expensive for you to manage alone. I'll manage, I repeated, my jaw tight. She sat on the sofa, uninvited, and crossed her long legs elegantly. Look, I'll be direct, she said, her tone shifting from feigned sympathy to brisk business. Thomas deserves his fair share of his father's estate. It's his birthright. Robert, he wasn't thinking clearly when he made those last-minute changes. It's obvious he was under duress. If you agree to contest the will with us, we can go to the court as a united front. We could come to a new arrangement that benefits everyone. The nerve of her was stunning. To stand in my home, a home she had tried to strip from me just moments before, and propose a conspiracy. Everyone? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Or everyone meaning you. Her smile tightened, the muscles around her mouth tensing for a fraction of a second. This foundation is a lovely idea in theory, she said, ignoring my question. But charity begins at home, don't you think? Thomas is Robert's son, his only son. Robert knew exactly what he was doing, I replied, feeling a surge of strength, fueled by pure indignation. He always did. And so do you, Victoria. You have never once cared about this family. You have only ever cared about what you could get from us. Her carefully constructed facade finally cracked. The practiced concern vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine, ugly spite. You've never liked me, she spat, her voice losing its syrupy sweetness. Not from the very first day. You've been poisoning Thomas against me from the beginning, whispering in his ear, making him feel guilty for loving me. No, Victoria, I said, looking her straight in the eye. You have done that all by yourself. She stood then, her movements sharp and angry as she smoothed the front of her expensive suit. The mask was gone. This was the real Victoria. Fine, she said, her voice low and menacing. Have it your way, but you remember this, Helen. Thomas will choose me. He always does. And when he finally cuts the cord with you for good, you will be completely, utterly alone. After she left, slamming the front door behind her, I sank into Robert's armchair, the weight of her threat pressing down on me. Was she right? Had I underestimated her hold on my son? The thought of losing Thomas completely, of him being erased from my life by that venomous woman, made my chest ache with a pain that was sharper than any grief I had yet felt. That night, I dreamed of Robert. We were young again, walking hand in hand along the moonlit beach where we had spent our honeymoon. The air was warm, and the sound of the gentle waves was a soothing balm. I was telling him everything, pouring out my fears about Thomas and Victoria. He just listened, his familiar, kind eyes fixed on mine. When I was finished, he smiled, that roll, easy smile that had always made me feel safe. Trust me, Helen, he said, his voice as clear as day. Everything will be all right. I woke with tears on my face, but also with a strange and profound sense of peace. Whatever came next, I would face it. I had to believe in the strength Robert had always seen in me. The next morning, as I was drinking my coffee and staring at the mysterious key on my counter, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from Thomas. My heart sank as I read the words, "Victoria wants me to move out of state. She found a job opportunity for me in Texas. She says there's nothing for us here anymore." So this was it. Her final move. To physically remove my son from my life. To complete the isolation she had been working toward for years, putting 1,000 miles between us. I stared at the phone, a wave of despair washing over me. How could I fight her now? Then, my eyes fell on the brass key. "For when you're ready," Robert's words echoed in my mind. The dream, the promise, the key. It all clicked into place. I was ready now. It was time to discover what my husband had left behind. In our bedroom closet, tucked away behind Robert's neatly pressed suits, was a small, heavy safe bolted to the floor. I had never paid much attention to it. Robert kept our passports and other important papers there, and I had always left that kind of thing to him. With fingers that trembled only slightly, I inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying solid click. Inside the safe there was only one thing, a thick manila envelope with my name written on it in Robert's hand. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lifted it out. It was heavy, full of documents. I carried it out of the bedroom and into the dining room, drawn to the large wooden table that had been the center of our family's life for so long. It was the table where we had celebrated countless birthdays, where we had played board games on rainy Sundays, where my children had done their homework under my watchful eye. Now, it would become the stage for a final heartbreaking revelation. With shaking hands, I upended the envelope, spreading its contents across the polished surface. It was evidence, damning, irrefutable evidence, that would change everything. There were bank statements, showing large, systematic withdrawals from Thomas's business accounts, money I now knew Robert had loaned him. The statements were cross-referenced with others, showing corresponding deposits into accounts that were solely in Victoria's name. There were credit card statements, detailing thousands upon thousands of dollars spent on luxury handbags, designer shoes, and spa weekends, all purchased during the exact same months she had been complaining to Thomas about their tight financial situation. Then there were the screenshot private messages between Victoria and two of her friends. My breath caught in my throat as I read their venomous words. They mocked my family, calling Robert and me her walking ATMs. They laughed about how easy it was to manipulate Thomas. One message, sent the day after Robert's cancer had returned, was particularly vile. Time to cash in soon. The old man is on his way out. Let's hope the son isn't as sentimental as his father. But the most damning piece of all, the one that made me physically recoil, was a formal consultation letter from a high-profile divorce attorney, dated just 3 months ago. Victoria had already been planning to leave my son. She was just waiting to secure what she believed would be his substantial inheritance, before filing the papers and taking him for everything he had. I collapsed heavily into a chair, the papers spread before me like a map of my son's destruction. My heart was breaking for him. How could I possibly show him this? Should I even tell him? Robert had left this evidence for me to use, but wielding it felt like a uniquely cruel act. It would not just end his marriage, it would shatter the entire foundation of his adult life, proving that the woman he loved had been nothing more than a predator. Yet, hiding it felt like a betrayal of a different kind, condemning him to mourn a lie and perhaps, someday, even fall back into her web of manipulation. Before I could decide, my doorbell rang again, making me jump. I hastily gathered the papers, shoving them back into the envelope and placing it on the coffee table in the living room, before going to answer. It was Thomas. He looked even worse than he had the day before. His eyes were wild and red-rimmed, his clothes looked like he had slept in them, and beside him on the porch was a small suitcase. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Can I come in?" I stepped aside, my own dilemma momentarily forgotten. He walked past me into the living room, and sank onto the couch, as if his legs could no longer hold his weight. "What happened?" I asked gently. "Victoria and we had a fight," he said, his voice hollow. "A bad." He stared into the empty fireplace, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees. "She wanted me to call her lawyer this morning, to officially start the process of contesting the will. She said, if I loved her, I would fight for our future. She told me I had to choose, once and for all, her or you." He ran a hand through his hair. "And when I wouldn't agree right away, when I hesitated, she said some things." "What things, Thomas?" I prompted, my heart pounding. He finally looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "That she never really loved Dad, that she was just waiting for him to die so we could get the money. That you and that we were nothing but stepping stones to the lifestyle she felt she deserved." I took a slow, careful breath, the confession confirming everything in the envelope. "And what did you say?" "I left," he said simply. He gestured to the suitcase by the door. "I just grabbed some clothes and walked out. I didn't know where else to go." Despite the devastation of the moment, my heart swelled with a cautious, painful hope. This was it. This was the moment Robert had predicted. After all these years, my son had finally chosen us. But I knew Victoria wouldn't let him go without a fight. He then noticed the manila envelope on the coffee table. "What's that?" I hesitated for only a second. Looking at my son, truly seeing him for the first time in years. Vulnerable, broken, and finally free. I knew I had to trust him with the entire truth. Robert had given him a path back, and this was the final painful step on that road. "Your father left this for me," I said, my voice soft as I picked up the envelope. "I think he wanted me to use it, if it ever became necessary." Silently I handed him the document. I watched his face as he read through them, his expression shifting through a terrible kaleidoscope of emotions, shock, then pure disbelief, which hardened into a cold, dark anger, and then finally crumbled into a deep, overwhelming sadness. "How did Dad get thee?" he whispered, setting the papers down carefully, as if they might burn his fingers. "I don't know. He never told me about any of this. All this time," he said, his voice breaking completely, "all this time I defended her. I chose her over you and Dad. I believed her when she said you were trying to control me, that you didn't want me to be happy. She was very convincing," I said gently. "That's no excuse," he cried, standing suddenly and pacing the room like a caged animal. "I should have seen it. I should have known who she really was. I was blind, Mom, willfully blind, and I hurt you and Dad so much because of it." I crossed the room and took his hands in mine. They were cold and trembling. They were so much like Robert's hands. "Your father never stopped loving you, Thomas." "Neither did I." His shoulders slumped, and a sob escaped his lips. "How can you forgive me so easily?" "Because that's what parents do," I said, squeezing his hands. "And because I know the real you, the kind, thoughtful, honest boy your father and I raised, is still in there. Victoria didn't destroy him, she just buried him for a while." He pulled me into a hug then, a real desperate hug, something he hadn't done in years. He buried his face in my shoulder, and for a long moment we just stood there, a mother and her son, beginning the long, painful process of healing. That night, after Thomas had settled into the familiar quiet of his old bedroom, I sat in Robert's armchair, feeling his presence all around me. The house was still, but it no longer felt empty. "You knew, didn't you?" I whispered into the darkness. "You knew she would push him too far eventually. You knew he would come home." The gentle creak of the floorboards in the hall was my only answer, and The next morning, over fresh coffee and toast at the kitchen table, Thomas and I began the difficult but necessary conversation about what would come next. He looked better than he had in years, despite the ordeal. The dark circles were still under his eyes, but the hunted look was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. He was determined to file for divorce immediately, but one fear overshadowed everything else. "William," he said, his voice tight with anxiety, "she'll try to use him as leverage. I know she will. She's already threatened to limit my access, to turn him against me if I don't do exactly what she wants." Before I could respond, to tell him about the powerful tools his father had left us, my phone, sitting on the counter, began to ring. It was Laura. "Mom, have you seen Facebook?" she asked, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and fury. There was no preamble. "Victoria's at it again. Only this time, she's posting horrible things about Thomas." My son's face hardened as I put the phone on speaker. "She's claiming he abandoned her and William," Laura continued. "She's telling everyone that he's mentally unstable, that he's having some sort of breakdown because of his grief, and that she's terrified of what he might do. She's trying to paint him as a dangerous man who needs help." Thomas listened, his jaw clenching and unclenching. The last vestiges of the passive man Victoria had created were burning away, leaving behind the strong, decisive son I remembered. "That's it," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm not letting her control the narrative anymore. I won't let her do this to me or my son." He pulled out his phone, his thumbs moving furiously across the screen. I watched as my son, who had been silenced by manipulation for so long, finally took a stand in the most public way possible. When he was done, he read the words aloud to me. "I have been silent for far too long," he read, his voice clear and strong. "Out of a misguided respect for a marriage that I now know was a lie, I have let rumors, accusations, and manipulations go unanswered. But I cannot stay silent anymore. The truth is that my marriage has been built on deception. My wife, Victoria, married me for financial gain, not for love. My parents, Robert and Helen Anderson, saw what I tragically refused to see for many years. He took a shaky breath and continued. Dad, if you're watching this from somewhere, I finally understand what you were trying to tell me. I am so sorry it took me so long to listen. He hit the post button. The silence in the kitchen was profound. Then his phone began to buzz. First once, then again, then a relentless flood of notifications. He glanced at the screen. Friends, he said, a small, weary smile touching his lips. Family. They're offering support. His smile faded. And of course, he held up the phone to show me a string of furious, rambling text messages from Victoria. She's threatening to take William and move to Texas immediately, he said, his voice tight with that all-too-familiar worry. She says I'll never see him again. I thought of the envelope of evidence, now sitting safely in Robert's desk drawer. The proof of financial misconduct, the consultation with the divorce attorney, the cruel, mocking messages that revealed her true character. Robert hadn't just left proof of her deception, he had left us a legal arsenal. She won't take William anywhere. Thomas, I said with a newfound determination that surprised even me. Your father made absolutely sure of that. He looked at me, a spark of desperate hope in his eyes. What do you mean? I said, reaching across the table to take his hand, that your father, Robert Anderson, was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else, and he left us a complete roadmap for dealing with Victoria. I explained it all to him then. How the evidence didn't just protect Robert's will, it protected Thomas, and most importantly, William. It painted a clear, undeniable picture of Victoria as a manipulative, deceitful, and financially irresponsible person who was planning to abandon her marriage. It was the perfect counter-narrative to her claims of being a victim. In a custody battle, her accusations of Thomas being unstable would crumble in the face of documented proof of her own character. As I laid out the brilliant, comprehensive plan Robert had put in motion long before his death, I felt a warmth spreading through my chest. My husband was gone, but his love, his foresight, and his fierce protection surrounded us still. He had known this day would come, and he had prepared for it with his characteristic thoroughness. For the first time since Robert's diagnosis, I felt the immense weight on my shoulders begin to lighten. We had a long, difficult road ahead, but we would walk it together, mother and son, with Robert's wisdom guiding our every step. Victoria had underestimated all of us. She underestimated Robert, with his quiet foresight. She underestimated me, with my patient strength. And most of all, she underestimated Thomas, whose true, honorable character was finally painfully re-emerging from the shadows. Her reign of manipulation was over. As my son and I made our plans, I felt a ping from my phone. It was a brief, professional message from Mr. Clark's office. Papers filed as per Robert's instructions. Court date for the custody hearing is set. Victoria has been served. The machine my husband had built was already in motion. 1 year after Robert's funeral, I stood in our backyard watching as my grandson, William, chased a monarch butterfly across the freshly cut grass. He had just turned 8, a milestone we celebrated with a joyful, noisy party that brought together our newly and truly healed family. My Thomas was at the grill, flipping burgers with an expert hand, a skill Robert had taught him long ago. Nearby, Laura was arranging a platter of fresh fruit, her laughter mingling with her nephew's delighted squeal. The past 12 months had been challenging, but ultimately, they had been transformative. Victoria had not surrendered easily. She fought the divorce and custody proceedings with a shocking viciousness, spreading a web of lies about Thomas's mental health, claiming financial hardship, and doing everything in her power to turn William against his own father. But Robert's evidence had been her undoing. It was our shield and our sword. The financial records that proved her deception, the consultation letter from her divorce attorney, and the damning messages that revealed her plan to abandon the marriage, all painted an undeniable picture for the judge. It was a portrait of a calculating, unstable woman who had married for money, not for love. The court awarded Thomas primary custody of William, with Victoria granted only supervised visitation until she agreed to complete court-ordered counseling. She never did. Shortly after the ruling, she left the state, moving to Texas with a new, wealthy boyfriend she had apparently been seeing for months. Her calls to William became increasingly infrequent, then stopped altogether. My son had blossomed in her absence. It was like watching a time-lapse video of a plant returning to the sun. He shed the passive, anxious shell he had developed during his marriage, and the real Thomas, thoughtful, kind, and quietly confident, had finally re-emerged. He'd moved into a small, charming house just 3 blocks away, close enough for William to walk over to my place after school. Our own relationship had healed slowly, and sometimes painfully, as we navigated the delicate terrain of past hurts and misunderstanding. But we had persevered, bound by a love that Victoria had never been able to break. "Grandma, look," William called, his face alight with discovery. He held up a fuzzy green caterpillar he'd found on a milkweed leaf. "Can we put it in a jar with some leaves? Can we watch it turn into a butterfly?" "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, my heart swelling. "Your Grandpa Robert would have loved that. He always had jars filled with interesting creatures when your dad was little." William grinned, revealing the charming gap where his front tooth used to be. "Dad said Grandpa Robert knew everything about nature. He knew quite a lot about a great many things," I agreed, feeling the familiar, gentle ache that came whenever Robert was mentioned. The pain had softened over this past year, transforming from a sharp, stabbing wound into a tender scar, a permanent reminder of a love that had shaped my entire life. Later that afternoon, after Laura and her family had gone home, Thomas helped me clear the dishes. We worked in comfortable silence until he spoke. "I found something yesterday," he said, drying a plate. "I was going through some old boxes in the garage that I hadn't touched in years." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound note. "I think it's Dad's journal." My heart skipped a beat. I recognized it instantly. Robert had carried that notebook everywhere during the last year of his life. I'd assumed it had been lost in the chaos. Have you read it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Thomas shook his head. "It didn't feel right. Not without you." We sat at the kitchen table, the journal resting between us like a sacred object. With trembling fingers, I opened it to the first page, dated shortly after his final diagnosis. I read the words aloud, my voice soft. "I've been thinking about legacy," Robert had written in his familiar slanted script. "Not the money or the property. Those are just things. The real legacy is the values we pass down, the lessons we teach, the love we share that continues long after we are gone." Page after page revealed my husband's innermost thoughts during those final precious months. His fierce, undying love for me, his immense pride in Laura, his deep, agonizing concern for Thomas, and his careful, methodical planning to protect us all. Near the end of the journal, one entry stood out, and I read it through my tears. "Helen thinks I'm being too harsh with the will. She believes Thomas will eventually see through Victoria without my intervention. Perhaps she's right. She usually is about these things. But I can't leave it to chance. I see the pain in my son's eyes, the way he is torn between his wife's demands and his love for his family. I have to give him a clear path back to us, even if it means making a difficult, painful choice now. I have to trust that the young man Helen and I raised is still in there, fighting to get out. And when he does break free, we will be waiting with open arms, ready to welcome him home." Thomas's shoulders shook with silent sobs. He laid his head down on the table, and I stroked his hair. "He knew," he whispered, his voice muffled. "He knew I was trapped, and he built me a doorway out." I turned to the very last entry, dated just 3 days before he died. "My dearest Helen will find this someday, when the time is right. My love, you have been my heart, my soul, my very breath for 50 years. When you read this, I will be gone. But please know that my love for you is a thing that continues beyond this life. The hardest part of leaving is knowing I won't see your smile, or feel your touch, or hear your laugh. But I go peacefully, knowing I have done everything in my power to protect our family. Remember what I always told you about gardening. Sometimes you have to prune away the diseased branches, so the healthy ones can thrive. Victoria was the disease threatening our family tree. By the time you read this, the pruning will be done, and the healing will have begun. Trust the process, my love. Trust in Thomas. And most importantly, trust in yourself. You are stronger than you have ever known. Until we meet again. All my love. Robert. I closed the journal, tears flowing freely down my cheeks. Later that evening, as the sun set, I sat alone on the porch swing Robert had built for me decades ago. Grandma? William's small voice startled me. He stood in the doorway, his pajamas on, a stuffed bear tucked under his arm. Dad said I could stay with you tonight. Is that okay? I wiped my eyes and smiled. Of course it's okay. I hesitated, then continued. You can sleep in Grandpa's study, on the pull-out sofa. He always said it was the best spot in the house for sleeping. His face lit up. Really? In Grandpa's special room? He scampered off. And after I tucked him in, surrounded by Robert's books and model trains, Thomas joined me on the porch. The night was warm, the sky filled with a brilliant spray of stars Robert had taught him to identify as a child. Do you think he knew, Thomas asked quietly, that it would all turn out like this? I thought of the journal, of the evidence in the safe, of his unwavering faith in his son. I thought of his final, ultimate act of love. Yes, I said with absolute certainty. He knew exactly what he was doing. He always did. We sat in comfortable silence, a mother and her son, watching the stars. The pain of losing Robert would never disappear entirely, but it had been transformed into something new, a legacy of love that had healed our family, making it stronger than ever before. That was his final gift. Not the will that silenced a cruel woman, but the love that had guided us back to each other. And for that, I would be eternally grateful. This powerful story is a testament to the enduring strength of truth and a parent's unwavering love. It reminds us that while manipulation and greed can inflict deep, painful wounds, they ultimately cannot triumph over a foundation built on decades of genuine affection and integrity. The journey of Helen and Thomas is a gripping illustration that even when a family is torn apart by devastating deceit, the path back to one another is possible through painful honesty, immense courage, and unconditional forgiveness. The ultimate lesson here is one of quiet resilience, to trust your instincts, to honor the memory and wisdom of those you love, and to always believe in the good that exists within your family, even when it's buried deep beneath years of confusion and hurt. Robert's ultimate act of love wasn't about money. It was about clearing a path for his son to find his way home. If this story of resilience, justice, and redemption resonated with you, please take a moment to show your support. Hitting the like button helps our channel reach more people, and subscribing ensures you won't miss another compelling narrative. Your engagement is what allows us to continue bringing these meaningful stories to life. We are always amazed to see how far our stories travel, creating a global community of viewers. To help us see how far Helen's journey has reached, please let us know which city, region, or country you are watching from in the comments below.